Welcome to this special edition of Mongo Spaces. We can start with you, Mugambi. You can introduce yourself, introduce CAK, and then you'll be able to set pace for the rest of the spaces tonight.
Thanks a lot, Eric, and once again for graciously hosting the Competition Authority of Kenya. So my name is Mugambi Mutegi. I work with the Competition Authority of Kenya. I'm in charge of comms there. CAK is the Competition Authority of Kenya, very different from another entity, Communications Authority of Kenya, that has a similar acronym to our. CAK deals with competition matters, macroeconomic level, not sector specific. So we are in any sector as long as it's competition law applies, then we have a mandate there. Ours is dual. We have competition law enforcement and also the consumer protection. So competition law enforcement, I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. We look at two things. They call it structure and conduct that can affect competition in any market. In the first instance, structure is where mergers and acquisitions apply because we're looking at the physical market space or market share that the entities have. So structure here is there's this company, it's this big, there's this company, this big, they want maybe merge or one wants to acquire another, that can affect competition. Maybe a quick example I could give is maybe petrol stations, supermarkets. Imagine supermarket downtown, one long street, and there are three different supermarket stores or chains on that street. So if one buys the other two, you don't have options. So in that case, that market share they enjoy on that street will change. CAK, if the companies are big enough to impact competition, we will have to intervene. We have certain thresholds on that. So in terms of structure, that is about it. So we'll talk about where you can approve a merger, we can approve with conditions, some of the issues that were mentioned in the OECD report, or we can decline a merger, which to date we haven't. Secondly, now when you go to the conduct element of our mandate, that's where you'll find a department called Enforcement and Compliance basically looks at, are you following the Competition Act? Are you following all the provisions in there? So the enforcement bit is, are you the legal line? If not, we enforce. The compliance bit of that is once perhaps even emerges, we give you conditions or we penalize you, give you certain conditions. Do you comply with that? So one is well attending to a matter, the other one is like a post review. So we normally give people maybe conditions, do this between now and this time. So the compliance department or subset of the enforcement and compliance department deals with that. So enforcement here is the core of what we do, and that's also the name, competition. And competitive conduct is anything that will come to distort how the forces of supply and demand, ideally in markets where they're not controlled, and in Kenya should be about the majority of them, with the exception of electricity distribution, and so that is controlled. So anything else, ideally prices should be dictated by the forces of supply and demand. So anything like price fixing where two competitors or more need to discuss prices to segregate markets that you play in this area. Output restriction, they say the product in the market is too much. Let's tone down on our imports. Let's tone down on our raw materials or production or raw material importation or what you're producing to try and play around with the forces of supply and demand. So all that, abuse of dominance, again, mentioned quite a bit sometimes, abuse of dominance over 50%. So all that can apply to anti-competitive conduct. So the second department, mergers and acquisitions, enforcement and compliance, deals majorly with anti-competitive conduct. We have a third one, which is not consumer protection related. It's called abuse of buyer power. So the department is called buyer power, but the conduct is abuse of that buyer power. And I think also we've had some big cases publicized in the last 2-3 years, mostly retail stores and the insurance companies and the garage owners through motor vehicle assessors. So here, I'll try to make it as quick and non-technical as possible. We have two people in a supply and buyer relationship. One, for instance, you can assume the buyer is on top. Remember that the buyer is on top. The seller is the one who requires the buyer. And this buyer has or controls an asset that is so important to the seller that the sellers are so beholden to them when they're sitting down to negotiate a contract. This can manifest in various ways, like insurance companies. I'll give you the examples that we made some intervention. The insurance company has a list of people who do motor vehicle assessment. When you get a motor vehicle accident, it goes to the garage and they have a panel of sorts. So you, as the garage owner or the motor vehicle assessor, need, or literally you're at the mercy of this person who gives you business. So they may tell you, I won't pay you in a month, I'll pay you in 3 months or 4 months. If it's maybe supermarket kind of relationship, the buyer-supplier relationship, if it manifests in a supermarket, they can transfer costs to you. They tell you brand the vehicle, have people at the aisles and sell their product as conditions to you being onboarded in that supermarket. Remember, perhaps this supermarket is the biggest in Kenya. They make an order of 10 crates of carrots. You supply them, then they say, no, we just needed 3. And they don't compensate you for the balance. And all that is documented, but because there's an imbalance in power, in bargaining position or bargaining strength, that people may abuse it. So they delay your payment, you go to them, they don't bat an eyelid, because if you bounce and terminate your contract, there are many other people waiting in line to replace you. So if people abuse that position, then it's abuse of buyer power, and we step in. And there are so many things you can discuss about that. Contract or law is an element there, whether or not something that is privately entered into 2 individuals or 2 parties, and there's precedent to it that can justify why buyer power exists or abuse of buyer power department exists of CAK. Lastly, the consumer protection, I won't belabor this because it's not even what was part of the OECD. OECD more or less sticks to the competition element, not the consumer protection. In this case, you have rights under the Constitution, Article 46 of the Constitution. So you need information to enjoy your full rights of products or a service you're buying. If you're injured or harmed by a product or a service, you're entitled to some rights. You have economic rights, your health, to enjoy the benefit of a service. For instance, medical interventions you've had, you all buy token, perhaps you send money to someone else using a mobile money wallet. Previously, you had to do some arithmetic to see how much M-Pesa balance or Airtel Money balance do I have. What is the balance right now? Then you tell. That goes against one of the fundamental rules of consumer protection. You cannot be expected to make a reasonable decision after you know the cost of that decision. If you knew sending perhaps 10,000 shillings to your bank via your mobile money is going to cost you 300 shillings, then it's 10 meters away from where you're seated, you perhaps would have walked. So the information does not help you ask at the bank. So we order banks and telecommunication companies to disclose that and send you receipts. So that has been going on. That was an intervention of CAK. We have various rights. And lastly, repair, replace, and refund. If you have issues, report to the person. There are problems, you come to CAK. At some point, maybe if you follow our page, you can get more information about it. We'll go straight to the discussion. With us, we have Dano. Dr. Dano is from CAK. He's the director in charge of policy planning and research. So in this case, the OECD report and the entire exercise will domicile under that directorate under the guidance of our Director General, Mr. David Kemei, who has sent in regarding this activity. And then we have Mr. Said. Mr. Said Ketsida is a competition expert. He works from OECD, based out of France. He's joining us from there. But during the launch of the report on 17th, and prior to that, during this exercise, he was around. So he's a partner of the authority, and welcome. So, Eric, back to you.
I'll go straight to the speakers. So we can start with the speaker from OECD and then CAK. Tell us a bit about what you do, and then especially perhaps OECD, what generally you do there as an organization, and then also specifically what your interest is in competition law in Kenya. Said?
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you also, Mugambi. I am Said Kishida. I am a competition expert, economist by training. I am the head of the Middle East and Africa unit at the OECD's competition division, and I led the team who undertook the review of Kenya's competition law and policy. Maybe just a quick word on the peer reviews. In general, this is one of the most important tools at the OECD. The OECD is an international organization that has 38 member states based in Paris, and it works across a wide range of public policies structured in committees that are composed of senior officials representing member states in each of the policy area that the organization is working on, and of course the secretariat that serves the committee and works on reports and assessments such as the one that assessed the competition policy and law of Kenya. So the competition division serves the OECD Competition Committee and the Global Forum on Competition, where what we call the examination panel of Kenya's policy, competition law, policy and law was examined and was presented in December 25. Peer reviews are actually a chance for a country to submit its laws and policies to substantive review by fellow nations around the world. The process provides insights to the country under study, promotes transparency and mutual understanding, and supports pro-competitive reforms. The report that came out of this almost 14 months process that was launched last week in Nairobi describes and analyzes Kenya's competition law and policy framework as implemented by the CAK. It addresses Kenya's legal framework, CAK institutional design and resources, enforcement processes and practices, including merger control, advocacy, market studies, judicial review, private enforcement, and domestic international cooperation. And it, of course, sets out a number of recommendations that have been grouped into two main categories. The first one, what we call priority recommendations for immediate action, and a second group of recommendations for the improvement of the competition policy framework in Kenya. I'll leave it here and let me know if there is anything that is unclear or things I can, of course, come back and clarify things. Thank you, Eric.
Definitely, we'll come back to you. So let me talk to Daktari here, Dr. Adano. You can introduce yourself briefly, what you do at CAK, now that Mugambi has graciously introduced what CAK is, as well you can focus a little bit on you and what you do.
Thank you very much, Eric, and good evening, Said, and all the participants in this space. My name is Adano Ario. I'm Director, Planning, Policy and Research at the Competition Authority of Kenya. I'm mainly in charge of policy and research, as the title states, and I do policy and research with regard to competition and consumer welfare issues. And this role is based on the competition law, which was established in 1989 first as price control and restricted trade practices in Kenyan jurisdiction. But then it was repealed in 2011, which also created a Competition Act, within which it also established the Competition Authority of Kenya to oversee market competition in the Kenyan economy, overseeing market regulation of all sectors of our national economy. My main role is to provide policy analysis with regard to reforms and also provide advisory services on proposed legislations insofar as they have specific impacts or likely to have impact on market competition and consumer welfare. And this process that we are assessing this evening in terms of peer review was initiated by the authority on voluntary basis, and it was undertaken successfully by OECD under leadership of and his colleague. And internally, the process was overseen by our Director General, and I coordinated with my colleagues on management of the authority, which also led to the report that was launched on 17th of March 2026. So I'm ready to discuss and share with you the operations of the authority, the structure, and some of the findings or observations of the peer review process. And the peer review process is generally and globally carried out by two agencies, which is UNTAD and OECD. And this particular review was done by OECD, and that's what we are going to discuss this evening. Thank you very much, Eric.
Let's start with the key takeaway. We can start with Said. What are your key takeaways from this report that you developed on CAK?
I would say I think the strongest North Star message from the report, we say that Kenya has a strong legal foundation and an authority with comprehensive powers. And now it needs to strengthen independent safeguards, resourcing, transparency, and enforcement impact. So the regime becomes more able to deter illegal behavior, more predictable, and more active across the economy. I think this is, I would say, the most important message, the key takeaway from the report. That, of course, we can go a bit on the details to discuss the issue of resources, why we think CAK deserves to be better and more resources in terms of public funding, but also in terms of the self-funding things that it might have at its disposal to diversify its resources and increase also its budget. We can also later on go into more details on the enforcement track record and what is probably needs to be done to further strengthen this impact. I'm not sure how you want us to go about this, whether you want me to give you a sort of general overview on all these aspects, or whether you want us to maybe go one-on-one on this aspect. Of course, in interaction with Dr. Adano.
We can start with the high level of view, and then Dr. Adano will add, and then I'll pick a few things here and there to drill down upon in the process. We can start with key takeaways in terms of what are the key maybe strengths and weaknesses that you saw in the competition law enforcement in Kenya, and what were some of the things that you saw that could be improved upon? What are the positives that you took away from that in your assessment?
First of all, as I was just mentioning, in terms of legal foundation, in terms of mandate, the competition law of Kenya complies with most of good practices in terms of international practices. So we have a solid legal foundation, we have a strong and powerful mandate. That's a very important starting point. Now, of course, we need also to have a well-resourced and well-staffed authority to be able to enforce this mandate. In terms of institutional design, for example, the report recognizes a commitment to independence and accountability in general terms. It identifies areas for improvement that could raise concerns about some kind of influence and continuity. These include absence of clear eligibility criteria and transparent selection processes for board members, a lack of staggered appointments that might affect institutional memory and continuity, a lack of clear dismissal rules for the senior management. And it also notes that the time of writing of the report, the positions of all non-government authorities, or what we say non-executive members of the board, were vacant. In terms of funding, if we can discuss this, we know that CAK is partly funded by fees and fines. And the report explains, based, of course, on the information collected from CAK, that around 70% of the funding comes from the state budget and around 30% from retained fees and fines. So the report notes that forecasting fee and fine revenue is always uncertain and creates the risk of enforcement based on only the fine revenue and can affect predictability of resources. So here, the priority recommendations include a kind of ring fencing government funding. So it cannot be adjusted according to fines or fee revenue. In terms of staffing, budget, etc., so the report doesn't really provide a magic number, but it prescribes a specific headcount or budget figure as a target. It sets resources, but resources should be adequate for core competition enforcement functions, and at least at the level of comparable jurisdictions, as it uses international and regional benchmarking to support the concern. Maybe a few messages also in terms of enforcement practice. The law is in place and contains the necessary provisions, as I mentioned before. But enforcement activity has been relatively low in the last 5 years. And the report notes that while the legal framework for sanctions and investigative powers is robust, actual enforcement has been limited, and it highlights heavy reliance on settlements, often with low financial penalties and without admissions of guilt, which may undermine deterrence and case law development. And maybe one would ask why the report has emphasized settlements so much. It's because we found that settlements are used frequently and often do not require admissions of wrongdoing. The report explains that this can weaken deterrence and limit development of reasoned decisions and jurisprudence. So the priority recommendation in this regard calls for clear settlement rules, clarified discount parameters, and avoiding excessive discounts and required admissions of liability in most enforcement cases. The report calls also for higher fines. The priority recommendations in this regard is framed as ensuring that fines serve as a deterrent by being proportionate to the gravity of the infringement and the turnover of fines undertakings, and adjusting fining guidelines so calculation better reflect aggravating factors. This emphasis is deterrence and proportionality, not fines as an end in themselves. So I would probably stop here for now in terms of, I would say, messages, in terms of the robustness of the law, the shortcomings that the report identify in the institutional setup, and also a few points and issues that require further improvement in terms of enforcement.
I'll come back to that. I want you to define a little bit what a have defined is like in terms of proportionate. Are you proportionate in terms of the revenues, profits, and all? I'll come back to that if you let me pick the brain of Adano. And if Adano, what are your key takeaways from this? And then can dissect a few of them. I think one of them was that the authority has reviewed around 70 mergers, but has only prohibited one. And then how do you respond to concerns that merger scrutiny may appear to be more procedural than substantive, like in terms of enforcement, especially on M&A front? So your general takeaway, and specifically that bit stood out for me in terms of M&A allowed and those ones which have been stopped. Dr. Adano?
Well, just highlight in terms of what the review observed or found about the whole process. It did identify, in fact, that the law itself as drafted is comprehensive and covering a number of mandates, including enforcement against anti-competitive agreements of the parties, abuse of dominance, merger control, and which you have actually highlighted as one of the areas of concern that you think are more relevant to emphasize, and market studies and advocacy. These are areas which fall squarely within the mandate of the authority. And more generally, the review find that the Kenyan framework is more dedicated to enforcing a modern and effective competition law and policy. And therefore, it's in line with most of the international laws that it compared the peer review process with. In terms of some of the highlights, which I see as relevant, is that the law itself is dual in mandate in terms of what my colleague Mugambi has mentioned, that competition law in Kenya has both a competition enforcement and a consumer protection, which gives that authority the key role of competition is basically to benefit consumers. And it also identifies as one of the highlights that the law also applies to all sectors of the national economy, which means we do also oversee market conduct that Mugambi mentioned earlier, insofar as they relate to competition issues. And being so, we work closely, which is also observed by OECD team. We work closely with sector regulators in the national economy. You can talk of any sector regulator like the Communication Authority of Kenya, Central Bank of Kenya, which regulates the commercial banks. And therefore, we do work together with these agencies to ensure that competition is fair and favorable to all players in the market. And also the merger regime, which is stipulated in the law, is a well-established regime. It also has a clear notification thresholds, and therefore it provides for effective competition and cooperation with sector regulators, as well as with the regional regulators such as the East African Community Competition Authority and also COMESA Competition Commission. So the law provides for that, and also one of the highlights that the review identifies includes those working with those agencies as well. And in addition, the law anticipates enforcement within the digital platforms and digital markets. And therefore, in that effect, the government has supported the authority to establish in the initial stages of its creation a forensic lab as one of the key installations to enable the enforcement of competition law, and also providing or giving evidence that will enable that process of gathering evidence for enforcing the law itself. We have also done a number of market studies, which is also highlighted by the peer review as one of the key areas where market studies, which tend to be confused with investigation, provide basis for or data for analysis of different markets and market segment that provides recommendation in terms of what are the gaps that needs to be identified by those studies, and made recommendation for any regulator that is not complying with the law to ensure that they comply with the provision of the law through advisory to those entities. We have also done a number of market inquiries and also advocacy that goes with that, creating awareness about competition law and consumer welfare, because one of the key aspects of competition law is not to actually penalize, but to provide information and ensure compliance with the law. And therefore, awareness creation and advocacy are one of the channels through which competition law issues are sent out to stakeholders as one of the major tools for competition law enforcement. And also I can identify, in addition, as one of the takeaway, the experience and diligence of the staff in terms of capacity building, ensuring that law enforcement, as dynamic as it is, continuously build capacity and increase numbers of officers who can enforce that law. These are areas that has been identified as internal advantages within the authority for enabling the authority execute its mandate as provided in the Competition Act of 2010. Now coming back to the issue around mergers, and therefore the number of mergers which has been made decision on by the authority, merger control in Kenya is well established as observed by the review process, but the outright prohibition of the law as identified is actually one of the reasons for us to go out for review to subject our merger process to an external scrutiny, allowing us to see how do we compare our merger process with other jurisdictions. And therefore, through merger analysis, any merger or acquisition is analyzed based on case-by-case basis. And therefore, one of the key ingredients is market analysis. Any object market analysis will come up with 2 or 3 main decisions. Following the analysis, we can find parties not violating any law or not within those frameworks. And therefore, there are certain restrictions that are likely to happen. And we provide merger decisions with conditions such as where we feel that post-merger, once we make that decision on the merger, then there is likelihood of them disadvantaging certain players in that market. Then we do provide conditions that those conditions are taken into account, including employment for a certain number of years post-merger decision. And the third one is, I think, what you are highlighting in terms of merger decision and authority not having made any merger decision without any condition or without approval but declining, is that these decisions are based on specific issues that relate to that particular case. However, what we have seen is that in terms of cooperation with other sector regulators and merger control, the process has been effective. And the recommendation identify a substantive analysis to be offered in addition to what we have been analyzing, that to weigh on more effectively on competitive effects of merger analysis, therefore providing additional or vigorous analysis to what the authority has been doing. But I would like to hear state that the merger analysis will be based on case-by-case basis and is objective, and also provide vigorous analysis to the players. And we do this through guidelines that we have developed to support better understanding of our analysis and the process we have followed. And in arriving at certain decision, may that decision be accepting the merger or accepting with the decision or not declining, as we have always done. But declining will always require certain restriction in terms of we are not able to provide behavioral remedies or changes in the structure of the entities that are merging or that is being acquired. Just wrapping up and saying that for any merger analysis, the decisions are always made on vigorous analysis, but the review provides another layer in terms of suggesting vigorous analysis of our merger notifications. And I have also explained that the merger analysis of the process is substantiated further to the parties.
Said, coming to you, the listener who was also sending a question in that regard, in terms of fines and them being a key source of revenues, especially for the competition authority, that does create a little bit of perhaps incentive to err on the side of issuing bigger fines, as you rightly raised. But I wanted to understand, especially framing it in the context of his list here, when do fines they become more of over enforcement and outright impeding a legitimate business conduct? Where do you draw the line? Is it 5% of revenues, 1%, 10%? Where do you do that?
Thank you, Eric, for this one. It's a very important question. Allow me to take just a minute to also say a few words on the merger asset that was mentioned by Dr. Adano and very well presented. Just one point to say that the report, of course, acknowledges the very good performance of CAK in this regard. Of course, the cooperation with sector regulators is working very well. We just think that the competitive analysis should get a more prominent role in assessing the merger compared to the over-reliance on public interest grounds. We also are saying that CAK should play a more important role at the regional levels. Dr. Adano mentioned very well that there is, of course, the COMESA Competition Authority as a first supranational framework. There is also the Competition Authority of the Eastern African Community that is supposed to start enforcement also very soon. And on the top of that, there is, of course, the ACFTA Continental framework that will also kick in at some point. CAK, given its prominent and important role in the region and on the continent also, should play a more important role, because these multiple overlapping regional regimes could create legal uncertainty and unnecessary burdens if not managed carefully. And we think that CAK is maybe in a good position to advocate for more clarity and certainty. This is just a few points that I wanted to add to complement what Dr. Adano was mentioning in terms of the merger analysis. Now, coming back to the point you mentioned on the fines. Actually, the fining guidelines of CAK clearly mention that administrative fines are up to 10% of turnover of the relevant markets of the companies that are being, I would say, fined or proven to be guilty, let's say. But in practice, we notice that the fines are relatively low beyond this threshold, and settlement discounts may be relatively large. Also, admissions are not required. So the combination of these issues weakens deterrence and leniency incentives. On the other hand, proportionate fines are critical to deter companies from breaching the law, which could not be perceived as a profitable activity, as you rightly mentioned. What the reports recommends in this regard is to actually implement what is in the law, meaning rely less on settlement discounts, maybe even clarify also the settlement discounts, and that fines should take into consideration the aggravating factors, of course, on a case-by-case basis, and to sensibly be increased so we can increase deterrence and credibility also of the whole process. Again, the report also notes that CAK lacks direct enforcement powers for non-payment of fines, since it relies on the ODPP to bring the action, which again can weaken also enforcement credibility. So it's a combination of things.
I wanted to ask, what's the best practice that you see from around the world in terms of enforcement there?
Well, actually, of course, having a clear fining guidelines on how fines are calculated, things you take into consideration, aggravating, mitigating factors, and of course, enable CAK to have some direct enforcement powers in terms of fining or recovery of fines, and not having to go through the ODPP to enforce actually a fine collection.
Dr. Adano, did you have something to add?
In terms of CAK imposing law fines, what I would like to just add to that point in terms of why the authority has been imposing law fine, I think it's good to just get to where we started from as far as 2011, when the authority was established. And at that time, there was no how we determine fines for the players. From that point where we more or less emphasized on the advocacy as over the financial penalty that we in the recent years increased. So we have progressively increased those penalties and created awareness to ensure that there's more compliance by businesses or entities to the provision of the law. And we have seen that over those years, penalty decisions we have always seen as a more or less a balancing act, whether to impose a penalty or encourage parties to comply with the law. And therefore, creating awareness so that whenever we penalize, people are violating law, that they exist, they know it exists. And in absence of that, there is duty on us as a regulator to ensure that more awareness is created, and therefore progressively as the authority grows with time, that penalty is increased, and ensuring that we persuade anti-competitive behavior to be progressively reduced, and also ensure that those penalties are proportionate to the conduct of the parties that we are penalizing on those issues. And therefore, creating awareness on competition issues became one of our more important obligations on matters within the jurisdiction of the authority. As we have seen over the years, we have seen that more recently we have now increased the fine levels incrementally over the years, and seen that now with 15 years of existence, and also providing basis upon which we are basing our penalties, and creating awareness that actually our penalties are not as high as most people perceive locally, is one of the avenues for us to now continue increasing our penalties in case we enforce law more strongly, particularly following the recommendations of the reform that will come out of this peer review process. So that's what I can add for now.
And one more thing about the enforcement practices, the report does note that there's limited uptake of leniency program. Why do you think this is the case, that businesses are coming forward to take up leniency programs? Maybe you can start with you, Adana, and then you can go to to Said?
That's a very good question. That's also observation we made in terms of leniency program not being popular. Leniency requires parties in the same market. Once they observe or understand the provision of the law, they are going to find a way of complying with the law thereafter, after learning that their activities or their conduct coming together to set prices for consumers is, or even agreed to reduce imports from outside, is going to be harmful to the economy and also the competition in the market, that they can come forward and declare that position to the authority. And one of the reasons, or could be a number of reasons, is that there could be trust within the sector or lack of trust among the players themselves in terms of understanding what does the law requires of them in terms of compliance, as stated in the Competition Act. And therefore, I do see that part of the reason could be lack of understanding of the law and the provisions, as we are trying to create more awareness, and therefore we expect that to grow. The other thing could be lack of trust among the players, and therefore they do see playing in the same market might jeopardize their position in that particular market, and therefore there could be element of trust, element of understanding of the law, and therefore the benefit that might come out of that. And also, our law is still very young, and leniency might be accepted as one way of compliance once we start reaching out to larger numbers and grow the awareness of competition law and competition infringement in the country in the coming years.
Over to you, Said, on the same question of leniency.
The success of leniency programs comes down to, I would say, a simple calculus that offenders actually take into consideration, which is the likelihood of being caught and the level of fines that are likely to be imposed. Across the globe, leniency programs have been recognized as a critical aspect of encouraging firms to self-report wrongdoing. In Kenya, the leniency program was introduced into the Competition Act in 2014 with detailed rules in the 2017 guidelines. The guidelines outline the eligibility, cooperation obligations, confidentiality commitments, etc. But CK has not received any leniency operation to date. And the report analyzes possible reasons for this, including limited enforcement record. So we come back to this again, the low penalties. Also, it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. So the likelihood of being caught, if the likelihood of being caught is relatively low, and also penalties are also low, so there is no incentives actually for wrongdoers or for companies to come to the authority and declare actually having engaged in this type of wrongdoing. This in addition, of course, to limited awareness, maybe fear of retaliation, and some ambiguity about criminal immunity, given the role of the ODDP and the lack of criminal enforcement practice. So these are a number of reasons that could explain the absence, I would say, of leniency applications to date.
Mugambi, I wanted to come back to you a little bit. I think you do a lot of market studies and advocacy programs at the authority. Could you tell us a little bit about how those work out and the efficacy of those programs, and maybe how the OECD reports might have maybe opine on the same?
As you correctly stated, we do market studies and also market inquiries. We've done several of them. I think the last one that we did was so basically like an inquiry. That it's not an investigation. It's CAK stepping back and saying there's an industry here that perhaps could have issues. You don't understand what is going on there, so let's start a formal review just to understand the value chain, what happens there, who are the players, what market shares do they have.
Actually make people a little bit nervous that the CAK is interested.
It's similar to this fines element question where it was saying it's low, other settlements, there's divergent views about which route should be used. So even in this case, when you come there, people don't necessarily welcome a regulator and say, yeah, take all this data with you, what else do you need? So yes, we have our ways. And the law also, and there, I think the elements OECD mentioned that you're required, if CAK purposes of an inquiry, a study, or an investigation, request information from you, you're required to present the same to us. Declining to do that or declining to submit that information can lead to repercussions, including penalization. But there's some improvement that OECD is telling us to also consider. The top of mind, some which you've had to experience impact. So the inquiry is not an investigation. I think you took me off tangent a bit. It's not an investigation. So at the tail end of the inquiry, which can last 10 months sometimes, because we have to go to the field, we have to as I said, engage people one-on-one, do a lot of desktoping, sometimes included, whether it's countrywide or whether it's a regional inquiry, also matters. So once we do that, we'll realize, oh, here there's a problem. There are consumer-related protection issues, there are competition issues, there's a bit of advocacy required. Sometimes you could go in there and you find that perhaps it's another government agency that came up with laws and not necessarily pro-competition, so they need to also advise each other, play a role which is part of a mandate, tell another agency what they need to do to get the market back on competitive track. So we do all that, then we give our recommendations. It could be quality recommendations. However, sometimes you can go in there and find that there is need for enforcement. It could be enforcement by us if we feel likelihood. In this case, then, so we will not use that information, obviously, against you. But if there's a need to open a proper investigation, we will do it. And also remember, when you're prioritizing a sector, which we admittedly perhaps don't understand 100%, we do it with certain prioritization criteria. So we just don't go to a sector which you don't understand and does not impact the majority of Kenyans. So for instance, the last one we did was on animal feed. And this one, we understand it's a government agenda for food security and nutrition. There have been complaints for years, the last 5 years, about the high cost of chicken feed, pig feed, and all that. So we went all the way and to understand what are the inputs of all this. And that's report public information. And the last two ones that, as I said, it could be a policy issue and not necessarily domiciled within CAK. We did a study way back, a banking sector study. There are some issues we found out. So the banking sector, the USD one was about when you're doing a payment transaction on your phone and you dial star rate, blah, blah, blah. There was a cost element to it. So he did a survey of that sector. He found that one player who was charging the high fees to terminate on their network. We made some policy recommendations in there, and we also ordered them to gradually reduce that. So we've done inquiries in the banking sector. We've done digital markets, made some recommendations. That's also referring to CBK when there was a hue and cry about the regulation of digital lender. Since it's not necessarily per se domiciled within CAK, when we were doing that study, we added a recommendation that I think there was a CBK amendment bill, which became an act, and there's a bit of sanity that was restored in that sector. I'm not saying it's CAK, but when we work together, we have MOUs, including with CBK, IRA, and others. So we share information. If you find something, so yes, there's market inquiries are a powerful tool, and the studies, and they either lead to policy changes or they could down the line lead to enforcement. But as instead, yes, people, sometimes stakeholders, business are challenged there, don't understand that an inquiry or a study is not an enforcement action. But either way, we have to understand the markets. Because, for instance, if we did go in somewhere and did a lot of very heavy intervention without understanding, you can end up skewing the market again unfavorably. So we have to understand this market even after you're trying to enforce. And with the digital space, things that just move so fast, it's good to understand before you also enforce.
We are now coming almost to the end of the conversation. So I want to give Dr. Dana some opportunity to maybe give us a few closing thoughts. And I think one key one I want maybe, especially the doctor, to highlight for us, what are some of the key things that you have highlighted as top priority from the recommendations you received going forward from the OECD? And then for Said, I want to ask him, what are some of the things that you think are easy lying fruits that the CAK can quickly implement? So maybe those are good places to close at as we wind up the conversation. Let's start with Dr. Dana.
Thank you very much, Eric. In terms of the bigger picture, the whole process of peer review provides us a very important benchmark against which to compare our practices, and also a platform for us to compare the enforcement compared with other jurisdictions. I think that's one of the major things, and what I would like to point out before I even talk about the take home for us from the whole process in total is that we are committed to really providing a very strong and effective framework that can allow us to promote competition throughout the national economy as mandated. And therefore, we do see this process in the long run increasing productivity in terms of bringing more investment in our national economy and also overall economic performance through ease of doing business, how parties can feel not restricted or no barrier to entry in any given sector of our national economy, that there's a fair play in any given market. And therefore, the direction we are taking in terms of, say, the outcome of this will allow us to have this strong and effective institution that will promote competition and also consumer welfare in the national economy In terms of the recommendation of priorities that we see are coming out of this process, one of them is we are going to retreat internally within the authority and see what are critical reviews of these recommendations internally for us and develop a very clear roadmap. What are our priorities for reform actions? What are those immediate actions based on recommendations that you can take home? What are long, medium term, and what are long term? As you will agree with me, Eric, one of the things is that these reforms also require resources, both in terms of financial resources and human resources. Therefore, we need to work very closely with our policy holders and our development partners. In consultation with them, we'll be able to reform our economy in competition space more strongly in the coming years. In terms of priority, more clearly, I think strengthening enforcement and anti-competitive enforcement within the national economy will be one of the areas we look into, looking at in terms of more detailed screening of market. Where are the challenges? What can we investigate given limited resources? Which areas can we investigate? Which areas can we sanction more closely to have effective markets in our economy? I would also like to see that given the law enforcement that has been identified, which we agree given the size of the authority, resources and requirement, we'd like to see more frequent and feasible enforcement action in the coming years to see that competition prevails in the national economy, and also ensure that the decisions we make are grounded in economic analysis and economic theory, and they can be tested in the court of law once parties disagree with our specific decision in a body of jurisprudence that allows us or businesses to comply with competition culture in the national economy. And the other aspect which I think we'd like to take up more strongly is we expect to see more feasible and credible authority as a whole once we have been able to do more research, more investigation, thorough analysis, then we should be more competent and also measure ourselves to international standards and also what other competition agencies are doing in their own space. Further, we would like to see that competition being more broadly and cutting across different sectors. There are certain sectors that are more important to government as well in terms of how government spend their resources through expenditure. One of them is Public Procurement Authority, where procurement issues need to be looked into more closely, and we would like to strengthen the existing cooperation with these regulators, among other regulators that we already have cooperation framework. And finally, I would like to mention that given the interconnectivity between competition and also global as a whole, our cooperation framework should not be limited to national regulators or regional specific sector regulators, but also expand to region in terms of how does competition in East African region, for example, or even COMESA region affect our competitiveness in the national economy. These are the issues we would like to take up and see that they are prioritized in the coming year and provide specific roadmap for us to enable us to take reform actions based on this peer review recommendation that we have launched recently. Thank you.
Over to you, Said.
Thank you, Eric. Would like to first start by thanking again CAK team, DJ Kamei, Dr. Adano, Mugambi, and the whole team for the trust and for their interest in getting a constructive and honest assessment of the performance of CAK 15 years down the road, 15 years since the inception of the setup of CAK. I think it was a good time to take stock of what was achieved and what can be improved. And for us, we, of course, the report explicitly recognizes strenuous progress and the existence of core competition law pillars. Now, of course, the objective is institutional strengthening. And then we spoke about the governance issues, the staggering appointment rules, or the provisions that need to be revised in the competition law in terms of appointment and dismissal of senior management. We spoke about improving deterrence, issues related to fines, sanctions, deterrence. Transparency also was a key aspect that we covered, and we encouraged CAK to publish full decisions so can create a good body of jurisprudence in Kenya. And we spoke also about resources, and we were very happy to hear from the PS of the National Treasury a strong commitment to reinforce the budgetary resources of CAK and to at least engage in a discussion on what needs to be done to increase the budget of CAK. The recommendations are framed as a way forward with the aim of improving the system. And we, as OECD Secretariat and team at the Competition Division, remain committed to cooperate with Kenya and to support CAK in being as effective as it can be, to show Kenyans that competition law can be trusted to improve market outcomes, increase welfare in broad terms, and to ensure strong, inclusive, and sustainable growth. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Said. Mugambi, your annual report is one of the things I like reading through. When is it coming out, by the way? And you can tell us something as you close up the spaces for us.
Thank you, Said. Thank you, Dr. Adano. Thank you, Eric, and also thank you to all the gracious attendees of this space. We appreciate that you took time to hear us speak and discuss this issue. In terms of the annual report, I may not make a commitment. I was told not to write checks that I cannot encash. But as usual, as practice, once it's ready, we'll publish and publicize it widely on our social handles. We'll share it with you. Also, I've just now attached a link to a mailing list. If you want to join our mailing list, the annual report will be sent there on the day it is made public, and including other material you can check on the comments. If you want to access the report, again, it is there. And maybe I'll just close by saying that the report was launched on 17th last week on Tuesday. As Said has just mentioned in passing, our chief guest was the PS, National Treasury. He went through the report, and I'm sure everyone at Treasury have looked at it. And they made some commitments that they will consider some of the recommendations that are in the report. We look forward to implementing. For CAK, there are two elements that perhaps that should stand out. This was not a compulsory exercise, and it was done with the sole purpose of self-reflection. We looked at the mirror. We didn't really mind what we are told. As Dr. Adano said, we now go back and retreat and look at the recommendations, chart an implementation matrix going forward, and see, is this possible? Is this in our control? Yes. It's not in our control. Who do we need to work with? So there are all those elements, and prioritizing what needs to be done, as Said had mentioned, done now, medium-term plans. But the best way of improving after a decade of enforcing this law, which we still consider a bit young, is that you have to self-reflect at some point. That is what CAK has done, and we're not shy on showing what the expert OECD have said. We may vary here and there in terms of some recommendations, but that was what the point was. What are the people who have done this in other jurisdictions? I think even Said didn't mention, I think they've done this in various jurisdictions. I think last count, there are some countries that have done several times, but I think on last count, there were around 29. And in Africa, I think South Africa has been done twice, but we are that in Africa. And you're not a competition regulator in Africa, for sure. So OECD has done 3 of them, Kenya being bad. So we looked in the mirror. We are going to do something about it. We'll combine this and the recommendations with a similar report, which was released in December by the World Bank in terms of competitiveness and how competition law enforcement can be used as a tool to reboot the economy and grow jobs. We'll combine the two and chart a way forward for CAK in the future. And we are grateful to OECD for the partnership and also for doing the exercise, which was tailored down. Thank you very much again, Eric, and to our attendees.
I should say I just signed up. I didn't know you had a mailing list, but I just signed up.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Said and Adano, any closing ones?
Yeah, Eric, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much to Mongo and also, of course, to Said. We have been working with Said, I think, for a long time, but very encouraging to work with you all along. And now we have the report. We are going to take it from there. And I would like to thank for the exercise and the process that led to the report, my colleagues and the authority management and our director general, and all the participants in this space. And finally, I would like to just put out as a notice or an announcement that the authority is going to have a research conference of competition and consumer welfare in June, 4th to 5th June 2025 in Nairobi. And we encourage you to join us during that session. And the theme of that conference is promoting competition and consumer welfare in a globalized and dynamic market. So this is one of the areas that we would like to see that we inform the public about our mandate and also about the competition enforcement in our country and beyond. Thank you very much, Eric, and the team, and have a wonderful evening.
Said?
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you also to Dr. Adano and to Mugambi and to all the attendees. I hope we managed to clarify the main findings of the report and the recommendations. Again, I mean, I think it is a very important initiative that you have here, Eric. Of course, it contributes a lot into the advocacy efforts and also creating the competition culture in Kenya, because it's not just the success of this undertaking doesn't only rely on CAK, it also relies on the stakeholders also in Kenya. raise awareness and to create this general acceptance and culture about competition. So many thanks for this initiative. Thanks again to all the attendees. And yes, hope to see you soon in Nairobi. So, asante sana.
Thank you so much for joining us.